Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar, Can I Really Get It All Done? This is a free webinar from American Baptist Women's Ministries, and I am your presenter. I'm the Reverend Sandra Hasenauer, and I'm the Associate Executive Director of American Baptist Women's Ministries. I want to welcome all of you who are attending tonight and say thank you so much for registering and for attending tonight's webinar. And I hope that you get a lot out of tonight. A couple of little housekeeping things to begin. When everybody enters the webinar, you are entered muted. You will have an opportunity for Q&A at the very end, and I'll talk about how that works in a moment. I want to also give a big thank you and a shout out to David Cushman from the American Baptist Computer Center. He is acting as our moderator tonight. If you have any technological questions, anything that's not working quite right for you, please use the questions box in your control panel and leave a question there, and David will be paying attention to that box throughout tonight's webinar, and he will respond as best as he's able to any of the technological questions. You can also use that box to ask questions about the content as we go through the webinar. Do know, however, again, that we're going to have a Q&A at the very end. I'm not going to be taking questions through the webinar itself because I have a lot of content I want to make sure I get through, and it's possible you ask a question that I know I'm already going to be getting to a little bit later on. But again, David will be paying attention to that box. During the Q&A, you will also have a tool in your control panel that allows you to raise your hand to let us know that you have a question. And David will then let me know who's got a question, and he will unmute you and take care of all of that to make sure you can ask your question at that time. Again, we'll get to Q&A at the very end. I also want to draw your attention. There are two handouts that you can download directly from this webinar right now. If you look in the handouts section of your control panel, you will see two links. Both of them are in blue font. That's an indicator that it's a live link. One of them is a printout of the of the PowerPoint that I'm using tonight, and it's got some space for you to take notes next to the slides. So you can download that right now and print it out if you're attached to a printer, and then you can take notes as we go along. Otherwise, it is something you can use into the future to remind you of some of the things we've talked about tonight. The other handout is called Can I Really Get It All Done? And that one I will be referencing a couple of different times during the webinar itself. So I would again suggest you go ahead and click on it and download it so you're able to open it up and look at it when I do reference it. I do want to say again, as you've seen in the promotional pieces, this topic was actually suggested by a participant of one of our earlier webinars this spring as something she felt was really important. And I immediately jumped on it because this is something that is near and dear to my heart, this topic. Some of you are aware that I often do workshops on self-care for American Baptist women and for girls. And some of the topics in this webinar tonight actually are related to the workshop that I do. Some of them I do in far more depth during that workshop. Other things I only touch on in the workshop, I'm going to be doing more in depth here tonight. Paying attention to our task list is actually an act of self-care. And I say that because, again, as was mentioned in the promotional pieces to this webinar, I have experienced actual burnout a couple of different times in my life, and I've been pretty close to it more often than that. And we often use the term burnout or, gee, I'm so burned out, and we use it kind of flippantly, but real burnout is actually a very painful thing to go through, and it's kind of difficult to regroup from that. It takes some time. I think a lot of, if not we ourselves, perhaps you signed up for this webinar because you either have experienced burnout or are feeling like you're experiencing it right now, you're on the edge of it. We also know that women in our churches either have experienced burnout, they are experiencing burnout now, or they're at high risk for experiencing burnout. And one thing we do not want to do is burn out ourselves or burn out one another in our attempts to do everything that we think God is calling us to do. So we're going to be talking a lot about all of these things that go into looking at our task list before we even get to the whole question of time management itself. I also want to give you fair warning. Tonight we're just going to be tasting a little bit of these topics to consider. I'm basically going to be planting a lot of questions in your head for you to ask yourself. I'll be pointing to places where you will be able to perhaps ask yourself questions about your task list, and then I will be pointing you to some recommended resources for additional reading and places you can go for more help on particular topics if you find them of interest. So tonight's webinar, again, can I really get it all done? We're going to talk about managing expectations, energy, priorities, and time. And I put those in that order because, again, there is a lot of foundation we have to lay down before we even get to task management and to looking at our task lists. I want to start out, however, asking you, putting up a poll, just to find out where we all stand coming into this webinar. What is the primary goal for you for your time management system? Are you trying to get more done? Are you trying to get the right things done? Or are you looking to feel less stressed and more relaxed? I'm putting the poll up right now. You can choose more than one option if you want to. And I'm going to give you about another maybe 10 seconds. Let's see if we can get 100% participation here. We're getting pretty close. We're at 85%, 90%. Surely the last 10% we can get voting on this poll. Okay, very close. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now and share the results. 22% of you want to get more done, 72% want to get the right things done, and 61% want to feel less stressed and more relaxed. Well, I'll tell you right now, you're all pretty much right in my wheelhouse. Although there are tips and tricks that I will share with you that might actually allow you to get more things done, what we're actually going to be spending a lot of time looking at tonight is getting the right things done. And by that, then we will feel less stressed and more relaxed. All right, so let's move on. Let's put it on the table first. Managing expectations. Can you really get it all done? Here's my answer to that. No, you probably can't. And I say that not to discourage you right off the bat, not to make you want to just throw up your hands and say, well, I might as well get out of this webinar right now because what's the point? It's actually to make the point that most of us have a lot on our task lists that we think we might be able to get done. And the reality is we are human beings and we have limited time, limited energy, and limited ability to actually accomplish everything we tend to expect ourselves to accomplish. So part of managing expectations is understanding why we have these expectations of ourselves in the first place. Why do we actually think that we have to do it all? Why do we end up with these mammoth task lists? First of all, we tend to compare our whole to someone else's part. We compare all of what we know about our lives with only part of what we see about someone else's life. So many of us hold ourselves up to other women in our church. Maybe we hold ourselves up to our mothers or our in-laws or other women in our lives or those women all over Pinterest and the blogosphere. And we think, wow, they've got it so together and they're getting everything done. Why am I such a mess? And the reality is we know our whole story. We're only seeing part of someone else's story. We don't actually really know how much they might feel like they're also a mess. So we have to be very careful of that. And that, of course, applies across the board, not just talking about our task list. But this is something we really need to pay attention to. When we start castigating ourselves about the fact that we can't get everything done, and we start looking at other people who look like they're getting so much more done than we are, we have to pay attention to the fact that we are comparing our whole to someone else's part. The other thing we tend to do is compare our internals to someone else's externals. And again, this is very related to the first one, but we compare how stressed and overwhelmed we feel inside about all our responsibilities with what someone else chooses to show the world. Okay, so again, pay attention to that. We feel like we're a mess, and we look at other people and say they've got it all together, but what they're choosing to show the world is that all together part. They're not showing necessarily how stressed and overwhelmed they are. So be aware of that factor as well. And finally, we all know it well, the superwoman syndrome. Somewhere around the 70s and 80s, we went from having kind of direct roles that we were expected to fill to the more open and liberating world that we could have any role we wanted, really. But the problem was that got interpreted not as you can have it all, but as you should have it all, and you should be it all, and you should do it all. We should be perfect wives, mothers, employees, volunteers, friends, etc., etc. And again, nowadays, Pinterest is a real symptom of this. We pay attention to everything that's going on in Pinterest, and we wonder, why don't my school lunches for my kids look that cute and adorable and have all those loving notes in it? I can barely get the sandwich in the plastic bag before I send them out the door. So we have to pay attention to these three things as our expectations. Are we comparing our whole to someone else's part? Are we comparing our internals to someone else's externals? And are we falling into the superwoman syndrome? So therefore, managing expectations means managing your expectations of yourself first. When you get overwhelmed by your to-do list, the first thing you have to do is look at yourself. What am I expecting of myself? Is that expectation realistic? After that, then, you can go into managing others' expectations of you. And of course, I use the term managing here with some trepidation, because you really can't do a whole lot about other people's expectations of you. That's their mental process. However, you can have conversations with the others in your home, with your spouse, with your children, with significant others, with parents if they're living with you, and talk about what are we expecting of one another in terms of getting the things done that need to get done. You can also have conversations with others at work. Some of you may be in work situations that are more conducive to these types of conversations than others. Unfortunately, in some workplaces, you really can't have these kinds of conversations. You just got to get her done. But see if there are places where you could have conversations to help manage these expectations. And of course, conversations with others in your volunteer world. For most of us, that probably means church, but there are also many other volunteer places where we may start feeling overwhelmed about the amount of responsibilities we are taking on or being given. You may have to have some conversations with others in your volunteer world as well. Now, obviously, that slide in and of itself, those things I just pointed out as bullet points, could be a webinar in and of itself. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go further into that tonight. Again, I'm just laying some questions for you to ask of yourself as you look at your task list. Are there conversations I need to have? And am I expecting too much of myself? So let's go on to our second topic now, managing energy. When we look at our task list, we tend to look at it all in sort of a flat perspective, that everything's the same on there, everything's equally important, everything's got the same amount of time, the same amount of energy. That's when we're looking at that list as a whole. We have to really remember that all tasks are not equal. Some tasks, of course, take more physical energy than others. If you're moving boxes, if you're cleaning, if you're painting a room, if you're weeding garden, physical energy is something that is easy for us to wrap our heads around and think about. We know if we're moving our house, there's only so much we're going to be able to do in the day before we fall exhausted on the couch and just have to put our feet up and rest for a while. That's our physical body taking over. However, we may be less familiar with the fact that some tasks take more mental energy than others. Things like working on a budget spreadsheet, planning a major project, attending to logistics for an event, writing a paper. The things that tend to take a lot of mental energy are things that either involve enormous numbers of details, or numbers, enormous logistical details, just a lot of moving pieces that you have to keep track of. That takes a lot of mental energy. And then anything that requires creative output, writing a paper, creating a project, doing anything that really has you kind of buzzing with creativity, that takes a lot of mental energy as well. Third, some tasks take more emotional energy than others. Caring for an ill loved one, making hospital visits, cleaning out the home of a deceased family member, visiting the homebound, volunteering with underprivileged children. Anything that involves your heart in any way is going to take more emotional energy than others. And finally, some things take more spiritual energy than others, such as leading a Bible study, leading in worship, giving spiritual counsel or mentoring, planning a Sunday school class, working in a soup kitchen or food pantry. There are things that take spiritual energy. Now, some of you may already be thinking, well, you know, that you've come up with a task in your head that you think could fit in more than one of these categories. Of course that's true. There are tasks that take all sorts of our energy, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, kind of all at once. Additionally, the mental, emotional, and spiritual energy output can be revealed in physical energy. When you spend a lot of mental energy or emotional energy or spiritual energy, a lot of times then you are physically exhausted. Often at our national board meetings in American Baptist Women's Ministries, we'll often hear the comment from board members, especially new ones, if they're unfamiliar with being on the national board. At the end of the day, they're like, I don't know why I'm so exhausted. I've just been sitting all day. Well, they're exhausted because they've been doing a lot of mental and emotional and spiritual energy output. So all of these things combine with one another. These four energies are something I often talk about in self-care workshops, and I go into much more depth about what each one of these means and how to replenish them, etc. But for the sake of our looking at our task lists, it's important to remember that each task requires a certain amount of energy, its own level of energy, and its own type of energy or energies. So the key to managing energy is remembering these two key phrases. When you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else. And when you say no to something, you're saying yes to something else. Now, a few years ago was one of the times I experienced pretty severe burnout in my volunteer life. And it was because at the same time, my work life was requiring more travel than what was typical for me in a given year. And it was at a time that American Baptist Women's Ministries was working on particular topics such as prison ministries and domestic violence and hunger and homelessness. And I was doing a lot of research into all of these topics. I was expending so much emotional, spiritual, and mental energy every day to researching and putting together all the resources I needed to for these topics, and really feeling just depressed every day with all of these things I was learning. I was exhausted every night, and I was still trying to keep up with all of my volunteer opportunities. I would finish my workday and go running off to run a committee meeting, or I'd finish my workday and I'd go running off to try to meet up with a family that had some needs, etc. And I just was exhausted the whole time. And it was around that time that I read the book that most of this comes from, and I'll mention that in a moment. And when I thought in terms of when I was saying yes to something, I was saying no to something else, and when I was saying no to something, I was saying yes to something else, it opened doors and light bulbs went off. And I realized that by saying yes to all of these volunteer commitments I had, I was saying no to recovering and being able to do my job the way I really needed to do my job at that time. So these are really key phrases to think and to keep in mind when you're looking at your task list. When somebody asks you to do something, by saying yes to a new volunteer commitment or a new responsibility, you are quite possibly saying no to spending that time attending to commitments and responsibilities that you already have, spending that time with family, spending that time with God, spending that time attending to your health. Or you might also be saying no to the possibility that someone else may have just the gifts and skills needed for that role or responsibility, and this is the opportunity for that person to be lifted into leadership. We all know the phrase, if you need something done, give it to a busy woman to do. Most of us tend to go to the same people. If we need help on something, we have our list of 3 or 4 names of people we know are going to get it done, and we just keep going back to those people. That might mean that we're missing somebody else. And as long as those people keep saying yes, no matter how busy they are, those other people may never get asked. So we have to be aware that when we say yes to yet one more thing, we may be taking that opportunity away from somebody else to lead. Conversely, by saying no to someone's request that you take on a new task, you're possibly saying yes to the possibility that you might be able to better develop your gifts and skills for the tasks that you already have. Development takes time. You are saying yes to allowing yourself to be open to opportunities that God may have waiting for you right around the corner. Maybe the request that somebody is making of you is something that you don't really feel like God's calling you to do, but you know, you should probably say yes because they may not find anybody else. But by saying yes, you're now filling up your time and your energy in a way that the opportunity God might have waiting for you is something eventually you're going to have to say no to. So you have to be very aware of that as well. And of course, you are saying yes to using that time instead with family, friends, God, or attending to your own health. Now, before you think I'm saying you should always say no to everything new, I'm not, because I am often in a position where I'm asking people if they will do things, and I don't want to tell you, always tell me no. I'd rather have you tell me yes. But that being said, I am giving you those questions you need to ask yourself every time you get asked to do something. By saying yes to this, what might I be saying no to? Or by saying no to this, what might I be saying yes to? Those are just key questions. So, managing energy. What I'm suggesting you do is to look at your calendar differently. And this is the big thing, the big change I made that few years ago when I was suffering from burnout. I started, rather than looking at my calendar as blocks of time, like I always had, I started trying to look at it as blocks of energy. Blocks of time tend to get filled up. An empty block somehow just becomes a vacuum waiting to be filled. An empty block can either induce guilt or it can be used to induce guilt. If you have empty blocks of time on your calendar, you might find yourself saying, how can I say no to serving on that committee? I do have some free time on Tuesday nights. Or somebody might come up to you and say, Sally, now that you're on summer vacation, now that you're retired, now that you've finished school, you're going to have plenty of time to do X, Y, or Z. So when we look at our calendar as blocks of time, that becomes a very difficult thing to know how to negotiate. On the other hand, if we look at our calendar as blocks of energy, that's going to make us think twice before automatically saying yes to things. Because again, different tasks require different levels of energy, and because of that, we need time to restore that energy. Therefore, an empty block of energy is not a vacuum. It's an opportunity for restoration. So those are some key things to think about. If you're looking at your calendar as blocks of time, those empty blocks of time are going to become a vacuum that either you or someone else is going to feel like you have to fill. But if you look at it as blocks of energy, you're more likely to take care of yourself because you're more likely to say, you know what, I know I've got some tasks that are going to take a tremendous amount of energy right now. That means I need to kind of back it down in some other areas. So here's what I want you to do. The handout, Can I Really Get It All Done? When you download that and look at it, if you look at it on your computer, page 2, if you print it off, it'll be the back of the front page. There is an empty calendar blank on there. And here's my suggestion. I'm not going to give you time to do this right now, but I'm going to suggest that you do this on your own because I think it'll be a learning experience for you. The first thing you could do with this empty calendar is using colored pencils and your own color coding system, shade in each day according to how much energy you typically have at that time of day. For example, yellow might be high energy, blue low energy, etc. All of us pretty much by the time we're maybe 18 to 20 kind of know our bodies and know our energy levels. Some of us are morning people, some of us are nighttime people, some of us hit our vibe right in the middle of the day. Most of us get the sleepies around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's kind of across the board. I hate leading workshops at that time because everybody's zoning out on me. That's, you look at your energy level and take that calendar and shade it in according to how much energy you normally have at that time of day. Once you've done
Sandra, could I break in for a second?
Yes.
Some have told me that they can't find the handouts panel. Could we have people just raise your hand if you're not able to find it? Okay, I see. Yeah, I see some hands going up. Um, if you send me your email address in the question um, box, I will email these to you. They're small enough that they should get through. Okay, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but go ahead.
That's okay. Thank you, David. I'm sorry people are having problems finding it. I'm glad that the rest of you seem to have been able to find it. That's good. Back to this calendar. So once you've shaded it in based on your energy during the day, then look at your task list by the energy levels that each of those tasks require and see if you can match tasks to where you're most likely going to have that amount of energy available. Now, sometimes, yes, we have things we just have to get done at a certain time of day regardless of whether we're feeling up to it or not. But many of us have the ability to plan out when we're going to try to do certain tasks. And a lot of times, if you find yourself moving a task day to day to day to day because you just don't feel up to doing it, there's a few reasons for that, and we'll touch on other ones later, but sometimes it's because you're just trying to do it at the wrong time of day. If you're high energy in the morning and you have a task that requires high energy, then it makes the most sense to do that in the morning. Whereas to leave tasks that are a little bit more mundane or mindless and do those when you already know you're going to have low energy. So that's one option you can do with that calendar. The other option you can do is use the calendar to plot out your week of responsibilities and tasks. This time, however, pay attention to how much energy a particular responsibility or task might take. Again, using colored pencils and a color coding system, shade in the task or responsibility accordingly. So if it's a high energy task, one that's going to require a lot out of you, shade it yellow or red or something. If it's going to require a lot less, shade it blue or green, something a little bit cooler and peaceful. And then as you plug those things into your week, look for those high energy moments and leave an appropriate amount of blank space after that for recovery time. Or if you absolutely can't just leave something blank, if you're like in work and you can't just suddenly say, oh, I'm going to take a nap in the middle of the workday, some workplaces allow that, most don't, then instead look for some of those very low energy tasks to do right after that. As I already mentioned, during my time of burnout, I was trying to do one high energy task after another, after another, after another. And eventually, I couldn't do any of them anymore. I was completely burning myself out. Whereas if I had been better about saying, okay, this is a high energy day, I need a low energy night to recover from that, I would have been able to preserve my energy as total much better. So that's homework for you to do on your own. I would be interested, many of you have my email address. Anybody can find my email address through our website at www.abwministries.org. I would love to hear your feedback about what you learn about yourself once you've done that calendar exercise. So now that we've dealt with expectations and energy, I want to touch briefly on priorities. And we're only going to touch on this very briefly, again, unfortunately, because we have a lot we're trying to get through tonight, and I want to leave some time for Q&A. Again, when we look at our task list as a whole, our brain tends to tell us that everything has to get done right now and it's all really important to do. So let's look at, is everything on your task list actually a priority? Again, thinking that I need to get this all done makes it all the same priority. So some questions to ask yourself when you look at each of your task list items. First of all, would anyone even notice if it didn't get done? Now, that might be a depressing thing to think about. You might be saying, wow, wait a minute. Do you mean there's stuff on my list that if I didn't do it, nobody would even notice? Yes, absolutely. We all have it. So we have to think about that. Would anybody even notice if it didn't get done? Would there be any damage or negative consequences if it didn't get done? Now, if it's a work situation, yeah, chances are there's going to be some negative consequences if you don't get your work tasks done. But there are a lot of things that we do in our personal lives that actually nothing would happen if it didn't get done. So we need to, again, take a very realistic look at every item on our task list. The third question, does it really all need to get done today? Or does it all need to get done this week or this month or this year? I am really well known for when I have a long weekend coming up with a couple of extra days off from work, I make myself a mammoth task of things I'm going to get done that weekend around the house or creative things. You know, it's fun and work stuff. And of course, I never get it all done because not all of it actually needs to get done that weekend. That's an expectation I put on myself. So when you look at your task list, does it really all need to get done today or this week or this month or this year? Another question, is this really my task to do, or do I need to let it go? And this comes back to a certain degree to expectations. It comes back to what we're expecting of ourselves, what we think other people expect of us. That's just a big question that each of us needs to ask. Is this really my task to do, or do I need to let it go and let somebody else do it? And then, similar to this, is this something I really need to do, or is it just something I feel obligated to do? Is it something I feel obligated to do? And if you say, well, yes, I do feel obligated to do it, obligated by whom? Are you really obligated to somebody else to get it done? Or are you only obligated to yourself because you think somebody else is thinking you're supposed to do it, when in reality that thought has never even crossed their mind? You have put that on them. You're trying to practice some mind reading, and that's never a good thing to do. So these are all questions to ask yourself about every item on your task list. Obviously, an awful lot of tasks are going to pass all of these questions and still stay on your task list. But you may find a few that you could actually say, you know what, I don't have to do that. I'm scratching it right off. It's not going to get done. Okay, so make sure you go through that process as often as you can. And of course, as women of faith, as Christian women, we need to pray over our task list because we need to be very clear in our mind about what are God's priorities for our time. Now, it may seem like God wouldn't care if we clean a toilet or not, but if God has said to us, you know what, I want you to be involved in this volunteer thing where you're helping to clean this house for this elderly person, then that toilet really does become part of God's priorities. If it's part of your family responsibility, that's part of God's priorities. On the other hand, could somebody else in your family clean that toilet for you? That's part of that other negotiation. Is this really my task to do, or do I need to let it go? You need to figure out and try to, as best you can, to discern what are God's priorities for your time. And this isn't something to just do once in a while. This is every time you look at your task list, be in conversation with God about that task list. All right, so now that we've laid the groundwork with the expectations, the energy, and the priorities, now we've gotten to task management. Let me say a word about the whole idea of time management, and that's why I really tried to avoid using the phrase time management in the promotions for this webinar, because time management is really a falsity. As David Allen says in Getting Things Done, you can't manage 5 minutes to make it 6 minutes. That's paraphrased, that's not an exact quote, but that's basically what he says. You can't manage 5 minutes to make it 6 minutes. You've got the time you've got. And so the idea is not you're really managing time, you're trying to become more effective about how you use the time you've got. Before we get into actual specifics, I want to say a few words about managing time and time management systems, task management systems as we go. First of all, no single system is perfect for everyone all the time. A lot of people say, you know, oh, you're so organized. What system do you use? Well, that person may use a system that really fails miserably for you. Plus, that person may actually use a hybrid of several systems, or might use a little bit from this one and another little bit from that one. No single system is perfect for everyone all the time. The second thing to remember, a system is only good as you make it. You can buy the best software in the world. If you don't use it properly, that system is not going to work for you. There are 3 keystone habits. Keystone habits are those linchpins to everything else working. I am using David Allen's Getting Things Done phraseology here and his basic framework, but these same 3 keystone habits will appear in some guise in just about every time management system you look at or task management system. The keystone habits are capturing everything, processing everything, and reviewing everything regularly. And we're going to go through each one of those 3 things. I'm going to give you a couple things to think about with each one of them. But the first question that you need to think about for yourself is, do you want to go digital or do you want to go handwritten? Some of you may be trying one or the other right now. You might have used some things yourself, either handwritten or digital, for years, but the fact that you're on this webinar tonight suggests to me that you're finding something is not working as well as you'd like it to with that system. So I'm going to just touch on a couple things here. Of course, first of all, digital, and by digital I mean anything apps or software related, technological related. The benefit to digital task management systems is that you can very easily do things on the move. You can add tasks using your mobile devices, your smartphones, your smartwatches, tablets, etc. For example, while you're driving. I get some of my best ideas while I'm driving. I remember all sorts of tasks while I'm driving, and I can't stop and write them down. So I use my smartphone or I use my smartwatch now, and I can just tap on it and say, hey Siri, remind me to get an oil change next week, you know, things like that. So that's the beauty of a digital system. It's also easy to move tasks around as your schedule changes. That is, of course, a blessing and a curse, the fact that you can just drag and drop a task from one day to the next as many times as you want. It is helpful. Many of the apps have location reminders so that you can set yourself up a list for a particular store, and then suddenly your phone is saying, hey, grocery store is nearby, you need milk. So it's a good way to remember what you have to do when you get there. And the other benefit to digital is it's easy to add tasks for the distant future. So things that you only need to do annually or biannually or every 5 years. I've got some tasks on my digital list that only come up every 5 years. They're in my digital app, which is wonderful. The benefit to a handwritten type, and the one you're going to hear about most is the bullet journal, is that you can customize it entirely to your needs. You can make it keep track of anything you want in the way you want to keep track of it. Whereas digital things, you can sometimes customize them to a degree, but you're really kind of stuck with the framework that the programmer set up. Handwritten, you do whatever you want. The second and more important thing about doing it by hand, lots of studies have shown that writing by hand actually helps recall and learning, and I've put a link here to an article that talks about that. For some reason, no matter how old we are, if we write something by hand, we tend to remember it better than if we digitally enter it into a device. And then the other thing that's pretty minor, but it can become important, and this is part of the reason I actually went to the system that I use, you can actually use a pen and paper at night without messing with your sleep hygiene. You've probably all read articles that digital devices emit blue light that triggers wakefulness, and again, I've linked to an article about that. Many digital devices are trying to work with that now and emitting a different kind of light at night or whatever, but still, anything that's pouring light into your eyes directly is going to mess with your sleep hygiene, whereas with a pen and a paper or a notebook, you don't have that problem. Whichever one you choose to use, digital or handwritten, the keys to making either one work are the same. You've got to be able to enter tasks into your system the second they enter your mind. You have to be able to know where to look for your entries, and you've got to stay on top of lists in either place or both places. I have, again, on that same handout, the Can I Really Get It All Done handout, you will also see I've listed a couple of the things I use there for work. I'm almost purely digital. I use a combination of Outlook and OneNote are really my 2 major programs that I use for that. Personal, I use more of a hybrid approach. I use an app called Todoist, and again, I've listed that on the handout, and I use a bullet journal. You're actually looking at a picture of, that was my last bullet journal. I've already blasted through that one. And I do a little bit in both, and I'm not going to go into detail here about what I do where, but my primary thing is needing to be able to capture thoughts while I'm traveling, when I'm on the fly, when I'm in a position where I can't write. But the bullet journal helps me actually process things mentally a little bit better. So managing time. the first step is capturing. You have to get it out of your head. David Allen of Getting Things Done talks a lot about your mind is for having ideas, not holding them. Our brain does not differentiate the importance of tasks. Our brain doesn't differentiate when tasks need to be done. Everything, David Allen says, everything you've told yourself you ought to do, your mind thinks you should do right now. Okay, your brain isn't smart enough to know what tasks are important and whether it needs to be done today or whether it's an unimportant one that doesn't need to be done from a year from now. Your brain expends the exact same amount of time trying to remember both of them. Peace comes from feeling in control, and control comes from getting it all out of our head and into a workable form. So capturing is the first keystone habit that you need to get into. David Allen recommends what he calls the mind sweep. You hear the same thing. It might go under a different name elsewhere. What you start by doing is writing every single thing you can think of down. You think through every area of your life, every context, and you write a master list of every single task item that occurs to you. The 3 keys to this are doing it by free association. Don't worry about organizing it yet. Just get it down. The second thing is to write down everything. Nothing's too small. Nothing's too big. You have to just get it down. You can't sit there and think, oh, well, I'll remember that later. No, write it down. The minute it crosses your mind, get it down. And the third key thing is don't act on anything yet. It's tempting the minute we say, oh, I've got to call thus and so to pick up the phone and call thus and so, or oh, I've got to send this email to pick up and start sending that email. You don't do that yet. You just write it all down. So the mind sweep, sometimes if you haven't ever done this before, you want to give yourself a couple of hours to do it. You might actually want to physically walk through spaces to think about so that you're triggered to remember, okay, I'm going to walk around the outside of my house. That's right, I've got to clean that siding. Oh, my garden, I've got to buy that plant I wanted to buy, or I need to replace that tool. Oh, my kitchen, I need to do this, that, or the other thing. At work, you need to think through all your projects, etc. In the book Getting Things Done and or on the website, which I've linked here, there are actual trigger lists of categories you can just look at to help you think through all of the areas you need to do for a mind sweep. And he also talks more about this capture process. Now, a lot of people, let me go back to that page, a lot of people say, I don't want to do that. It would be overwhelming to look at that list. The fact of the matter is it's actually very freeing. Once you get it all down and you're not trying to remember it in your head, then you can process it. That's critical. What is processing? The key thing here is the difference between a project and a task. A task is an action item or a discrete action that can be accomplished. It has a verb and preferably it has a date. So for example, a task is call the veterinarian tomorrow to make an appointment for the cat's annual physical. All right, call is your action or is your verb. The date is tomorrow, and it's very specific about who you're calling and what you're calling them for. A project, however, includes several tasks to accomplish over time. So, for example, many of us are tempted to write something like, if we've moved into a new town, find a veterinarian on our task list. That's not actually a task. That's a project, because it involves things like research what vets are in the area, read reviews of vets that are found, ask Marcia and Tanya, my best friends, about their vets, choose a vet, call the vet to find out if they're accepting new patients, make your first vet appointment, and complete paperwork for that first appointment. So you can see in those 2 words, find veterinarian, there are lurking a bunch of tasks. This is really important to remember because it makes a big difference to how you approach your task list in the next step. Before we get there, I want to find out if you've really kind of absorbed what the difference is between a project and a task. So I've got another quick poll for you here. Is the following a project or a task? You can only choose one or the other. I'm going to give you about 15 seconds to say, is this a project or is this a task? Okay, we're at about 86% voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. and share it. About 39% of you said project and 61% said task. Arguably, this one is a project. To a certain degree, that kind of depends on where you're at in your life. If you don't always get your oil changed at the same place, you have to decide where you're going to have your oil changed. How do you need to make your appointment? Do you call? Do you do it online? Do you just show up? When do you need the appointment to be scheduled? Do you need it immediately? Can you wait? Is it just coming up in the next couple of weeks? So, arguably, the phrase oil change is actually a project. It would be far better on your task list to write make appointment for oil change next week, or research prices for oil changes near me, or whatever it is specific to your situation with oil change, to know whether that's a project or a task. All right, we're going to try the next one. Is this one a project or a task? Research contractors on Annie's list for kitchen remodel. Is that a project or a task? I'm giving you about 15 seconds. Okay, a couple of last minute votes in there. 81% of you voted. I'm going to go ahead and close it so we can move on. 72% of you said this was a project, 28% was a task. This is actually a task because you have research is your verb. You're researching contractors on Annie's list. You're being specific about where you're doing it and what you're doing it for. The only thing this is missing is a specific date. That would make it even stronger. But if this was on your task list, you would know exactly what you're supposed to be doing next. Okay? So that is the difference between projects and tasks. Why is this so important to keep track of? Because projects masquerading as tasks are less likely to get done. If you have something on your task list that is actually a project, actually has a lot involved, that means it hasn't really been clarified yet. There's a lot of decisions yet to be made, and that makes it feel more overwhelming because those things aren't clarified. Your brain looks at that and sort of shorts out. It's like, oh, wait, I'm not ready for that yet. If you just had kitchen remodel on your task list, it would never get done. You really have to clarify, okay, what does that actually mean? What are the steps involved in that? Okay? So the next thing you need to do once you've clarified what's a process or what's a project and what's a task, once you've gotten things down to tasks, you need to decide whether you're going to do it, whether you're going to delegate it, or whether you're going to defer it. Doing it, David Allen talks about the 2-minute rule. If you can do something in 2 minutes, just get it done. And he also says what we truly need to do is often what we feel most like avoiding. If there's something causing you stress, you'll be a lot happier if you just get it done. The second thing is to delegate it, and we've talked about this before. Are you actually the best person to do this task, or is somebody else maybe in a better position to do it? And the third thing is to defer it or calendarize it for later. And in this case, you're going to want to use triggers and reminders to make sure it gets done. Again, each task management system is going to have its own ways to do this. If you're using a handwritten, like a bullet journal or something, it's a little bit harder to shoot things too far into the future, so you're going to want to have your master Minesweep list that you refer back to periodically, and then just keep putting it into your calendar as you go. If you're working digitally, it's a lot easier to shoot things into the future. Now again, David Allen, in his book Getting Things Done, spends chapters on each one of these three things: doing it, delegating, and deferring it. Probably more time on doing and deferring than he does on delegating. But if you want to look into that further, you will want to consult that book. The other thing, the other key habit, the third part of this that's critical, is reviewing. If you have a list, it doesn't do you any good unless you're looking at it consistently and keeping it up to date. So what David Allen talks about, what most of these task management systems talk about, is setting aside a regular time each week to review all your tasks and project lists. The image I'm showing you here is, I looked way into the future to find a blank week on my calendar with no appointments or anything already scheduled in there. you will see every morning and every afternoon in my workday, I have on my calendar email and organize, or email and organize each day. Every day I'm looking at my task list twice, minimum, to make sure I know what I've got going on, to make sure it's up to date, etc. Then at the end of the week, you see in red there, weekly review and email and organize next week. That's when I go through what have I gotten done this week, what needs to get pushed into next week, and then I look ahead at next week and try to get myself organized for next week. I do the same basic thing personally. I'm just doing it in a bullet journal or on Todoist, but I also do that morning and evening before work and then before I go to bed, and every weekend I spend time looking at the following week. So my task list gets looked at least minimum twice a day, if not more often. And that's really critical to keeping on top of all your tasks. You've got to be reviewing them constantly. So, can I really get it all done? If you're managing your expectations, you may not actually have to get it all done. If you're managing your energy, you're going to remember that saying yes means saying no and vice versa, and managing your energy makes you more productive in the long run. And if you're managing your priorities, you're going to know that you're focusing attention exactly where it should be focused. And finally, if you're managing time, you're getting things out of your head, you're going to understand the difference between the task and the project, and you're going to remember that a system only works as much as you work the system. So that's a really fast overall overview into 4 very significant topics that have to do ultimately with your task list and your stress level. So we're going to open it up to Q&A right now. David, do we have any questions in the question box yet?
We have some questions that had to do with tech support, but
Okay.
I think people have been paying pretty close attention. I did email the handouts to those who indicated they couldn't get them from the handout panel. If you have questions for Sandra, now's the time to send them into the question panel, and I'll hand them off to her. I guess we can give it, a moment to see. People may not have thought of their questions yet.
Okay, you can also use the hand raised or raising hand icon if you can find that on your control panel.
Let's see. Yeah, the questions that appear up there had to do with tech support.
Okay.
Okay, here's a question from Ladane Pulaski. She says, sometimes I feel like I spend more time planning what I'm going to do than I spend doing it. Any ideas?
I have the same problem, mostly because it's a whole lot more fun to plan than to do. And so we do have to sometimes stop ourselves from planning. But the thing that I always say to myself and to other people is the more time you put into something at the front end, the less time you have to put into it at the back end. A really good plan at the beginning actually saves you time in the long run. What you have to be paying attention to, though, are you planning because you still need to plan? Does that mean there really are still decisions that need to be made and clarifications that need to be made? Or are you planning to avoid the doing? And we all know what that feels like. That's, again, where you just have to be very self-aware. But yes, it is possible to hide in our planning. But if we find ourselves needing to go back to planning, that might mean there is some question in there that hasn't been answered yet. And you may want to look again at, is this actually a task or is this a project? Thank you for the question.
And she says, thanks. Other questions? You covered a lot of ground. I think, Sandra, could we get a show of hands from people who have now received or downloaded the handouts? If you were able to do that, or if you got them from me via email. So we're missing, looks like about half the people didn't get those yet, Sandra. We can email these to people later on. They're small enough that they should go through fine.
Yes, certainly. We can make sure they get attached. Everybody on this webinar will get at least one email, maybe two, as follow-up, and you will get them then. The other thing is these webinars are recorded and it will be posted and made available for free for you to review again. I would also be interested to know, again, I covered 4 major topics in this, each of which could be its own webinar or series of webinars. So if after listening to this or participating in this webinar, there's particular aspects of it that you really feel like, you know, I need to do some more work on this or whatever, please include that in when you get the evaluation question. One of those is future topics for other webinars, so make sure you note that. But, you know, to say, wow, Sandy really just kind of breezed through priorities really fast, that's something we'd really like to spend more time on, or whatever. Are there any other questions?
I don't see any here. You've covered a lot of ground tonight.
There's a lot to talk about. You know, again, as I said at the very beginning, we often look at our task list as sort of this discrete unit when the reality is there's an awful lot that goes into it. I had several slides that I took out because I knew I had too much content going in. You will see things about mission statements, for example, as a way to related to priorities. And David Allen actually makes the point that your brain doesn't have the space or the energy to be able to do that big picture thinking until you get all of those tasks out of your head. So that's where he always starts with the mind sweep. And I have found that very, very helpful. So if there's only one thing that you take away from this webinar, it's to sit down sometime in the next couple days and get everything out of your head, get it all written down. Don't worry about how long a list it becomes, because once you get it written down, then you can start dealing with it. You will have the energy and the mental space to start dealing with it. Are there any other questions? We've still got about 2 minutes. Well, 1. All right, then. I will again remind you, you will all get an evaluation after this webinar. Please do complete that evaluation. It's very short, very easy for you to do. And especially, again, if you have any suggestions for future webinars, AB Women's Ministries does already have a few that it's starting to work on for next year. There won't be any for the summer, but there will be some starting again in the fall. So please let us know what topics are of interest to you, and they will be taken into consideration with everything else. David, do you have any last comments about process things?
No, I think we'll just make sure we follow up with those who weren't able to retrieve. And we have a comment here for you from Leica. Is that the correct pronunciation? It says, thank you, very informative.
Oh, good. Thank you, Leica. I hope I didn't overwhelm you all. All right. Well, thank you very much for attending the webinar. Again, please respond to the evaluation, and I hope to see you all on future webinars, whatever those topics may be. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Good night.